I'm here with Senator Angus King of Maine, and I just want to thank you for being on with us.
Delighted.
I want to start with your tenure as governor of Maine.
Sure.
One of your notable achievements was a focus on the Maine Learning Technology Initiative. And let's look at Race to the Top, which is more of a national program.
Right.
And do you think government's done well when it comes to emphasizing tech for students?
Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Education, of all the sectors in our society, education probably has the lowest penetration of technology in daily use of anything, of business. I mean, imagine going into an office today in America and seeing one computer in the whole room.
Right.
It just wouldn't happen. Go into a medical facility, go into a law office, go into a business office, go into a manufacturing facility, go into a school, and the school looks exactly the way it looked in 1750. Bunch of kids in desks, teacher at the front. Did you ever think of that? Education is really delivered in almost exactly the same model that it was delivered in 100 years ago, 500 years ago. So we're improving, but I don't think we're anywhere near where we should be. And one of the reasons is kids graduate from school out into a world where it's all digital. And of course, young people have sort of jumped over the schools in a sense because they're digital outside of the school. How sensible is it to power down when you go to school and power up when you leave?
Right.
And yet that's what's the case in most parts of American education. So that was the sort of fundamental impetus for the Maine Learning Technology Initiative, which was now 12 years ago, or 10 or 11 years ago, in 2001, 2002. And it was all about giving our students the tools to get their own education, right. Which is ultimately where I think education is going. And it's been a pretty amazing project.
Bill Gates and even Mark Zuckerberg, they've been teaming up to pretty much offer, they want to advocate for offering coding as a class in the educational system. So I think that would help out a lot in that initiative. Let's move on to the Senate, actually. One of the issues you ran on in the past election was saying that you want the Senate to move towards functionality.
Yeah.
And because you're on the Rules and Administration Committee, I'm sure that you would be able to work on that agenda a lot.
That's part of the reason I wanted to be on that committee.
Definitely. So what issues exactly would you want to bring up during the committees?
Well, you know, it's before you get to issues, you have to talk about process. And when most people talk about process, you sort of go to sleep. You know, process is boring. In this case, process is the whole deal, because if we don't improve the process around this place, we never get to the issues. You know, if you have constant filibusters and constant delays and we haven't had a budget in 4 years around here, you know, you can't deal with issues like immigration or, you know, technology policy or energy policy or healthcare, any of those kinds of things. And so when I came here, it was really where I start is trying to make the place work better. Now that doesn't mean I'm not interested in healthcare or energy or intelligence or all those things, but the process. Now, the first week I was here, we had some votes on improving the filibuster rules. It remains to be seen whether that was enough. We hoped and thought that maybe that would improve things, and here we are, as you and I are sitting here, there's a filibuster going on.
Right.
And it may be that more changes have to be made because the place isn't working.
What kind of obstacles have you what kind of obstacles have gotten in your way when it comes to addressing that process?
The biggest obstacle is the belief, particularly among the more senior senators, that the essence of this place is the protection of the minority. And if you go back and read the Federalist Papers and read the Constitution and read the discussions at the convention, it was designed as a place that would be somewhat immune from the public mood of, you know, something roars through the House because it's a body that's elected every 2 years. The Senate's supposed to slow things down. Only 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. It was designed to be a more deliberative body. The problem is, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've gone overboard. When Lyndon Johnson was the majority leader of the Senate, and they had some very contentious issues when he was here back in the late 50s, he had one filibuster in 6 years. Since Harry Reid's been majority leader for 6 years, he's had to cope with 385 filibusters. That's ridiculous. That's not the way the system is supposed to work. Now, I can tell you from having participated in the debates about the filibuster at the beginning of the year, there's a tremendous reluctance to turn this into a majority body where 51 votes can do anything. So we're trying to sort of find the right balance, but a lot of it has to rely on good faith. You can make a partial change and make it a little bit easier or harder to filibuster in certain situations, but in the end, there has to be, the parties have to meet each other halfway. And by the way, there's no, you can put some blame at the feet of both parties. I mean, part of what's going on, for example, yesterday there was a filibuster of a judge by the Republicans. 7 years ago, the Democrats were filibustering judges nominated by George W. Bush.
Right.
And so for every example of abuse by the Republicans, there's some example of the similar problems when the Democrats were in charge. And in fact, it was very interesting in the debates within the Democratic caucus, there was sort of a split in the caucus between those senators who had been here in the minority and those who had only been here in the majority. And the ones who had been here, the older senators who had been here when the Democrats were in the minority, were saying, slow down, guys. There may come a time when you want to have the filibuster. You don't want to take away this tool because, you know, if you got a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and they're trying to do things that you think is fundamentally bad for the country, you want to have this tool. So you see the dilemma? I mean, it's not as easy to say, oh yeah, let's get rid of the filibuster.
Definitely.
It's a fairly complicated calculation, but I think if we continue to see more filibusters during the course of this year, you're going to see the Democrats are going to go back and say, wait a minute, we got to go further.
I mean, if you look at any of the presidential appointments lately, I mean, I know John Brennan's having a hard time. And
Chuck Hagel was
pretty,
yeah, and we just had a circuit court judge filibuster.
Right.
And I, as a kind of neutral in the sense of being an independent, although I'm caucusing with the Democrats, that's not right.
You mentioned that you were caucusing with the Democrats in the Senate, but you're listed as an independent.
Right.
Is it ever frustrating to deal with these party politics?
Of course it is, because I must have been born without the right gene, because I don't understand this impulse to say those other guys are bad, we're good. I mean, in my experience, good idea. There's nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. Now, I may agree more with the Democrats at this moment. People say, well, you know, you're more of a Democrat than a Republican. I said, it depends on when you're talking about. Because the Republicans, you know, that I grew up with a pretty moderate Republican Party, President Eisenhower. Even Nixon would be considered a dangerous liberal in today's Republican Party. So the Republican Party has moved considerably, but I am frustrated by it because often I think it becomes a barrier in and of itself to solving problems. That if a Democrat has the idea, then it's obviously no good, and if it's Obama's idea, then we got to vote against it. And I have noticed one of the things that's frustrated me here already is there's so much emphasis on winning and losing. You think about it. You hear this, we're in this sequester fight now, and what you hear either openly or sometimes a little bit behind the scenes is, Obama won the fiscal cliff, we can't let him win this. I mean, it paralyzes you if you have to do it that way. You're keeping score, and it has nothing to do with what's good for the country. What's the best solution for the country? I don't care who wins or loses. I wish we didn't have to keep score, but the media around here, all of these journals, that follow the Capitol Hill obsessively, it's always who's up and who's down, and did Harry Reid cave on the filibuster and all that kind of stuff, and that doesn't help us to get to a place where we could make effective decisions.
Now, one last question, pretty much going on the independent track.
Sure.
We have college students and citizens in general who have aspirations for public office someday and probably want to run as independents. You were able to accomplish this, and it's very hard in today's world to do that. So what advice do you have for them?
Well, it is hard, and I don't think it would be realistic if I said, oh yeah, go for it. It really depends on the circumstances of your state. When I ran for governor of Maine as an independent, we had an independent governor 20 years before, who was pretty popular. So it was thinkable. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
It was thinkable for the citizen to vote for an independent. The biggest problem an independent has is convincing the voters that they're not wasting a vote, that this is a viable option. And that's hard, particularly in a state where it's never happened before. In Maine, you know, it had happened. We'd had an independent governor. Then I served as an independent governor. Now I'm an independent senator. So in Maine, it's kind of common.
Right.
But in, you know, New Jersey or Tennessee or someplace, it's very difficult. I think it's going to get easier and easier. I mean, I think your generation is much less tied to party than prior generations. And you can see that just in the registration figures. I mean, the party, I think I'm right about this, party registration is generally on a slow downward trend in both parties. Non-enrolled or independence is on the way up.
Right.
But in order to run as an independent, what you have to do is establish some credibility outside of the political arena. I was a successful business person. I also was in media. I used to interview people. I was the Jim Lehrer of Maine for 15 years. And I interviewed people on public broadcasting. So people knew me and they felt they had a sort of a concept of who I was and how I thought. And I think that made some difference. In other words, I just didn't walk in and say, hey, I want to be governor.
Right.
Okay. But frankly, I don't have anything against the two-party system. I just wish they'd get their acts together and quit fighting with each other so much and start talking to each other and getting the problem solved.